Welcome everybody to this mini lecture about states and regimes for Module 3. These are the things that this mini lecture is going to focus on, as noted on this slide. The first thing that I'm going to do is just clarify some terms because these are often used in the popular press and it seems like they're used interchangeably, but they really do refer to distinct things in political science. So the state is basically what is ruled. This is the definition of the state that's provided for you here. I know it's kind of long and a little bit jargony, but basically it's what is being ruled. A political regime is how that state is ruled. So these are the formal and the informal rules that define how a state is governed. The basic distinction between regimes is, are they democracies? So do you have peaceful turnover leadership and free and fair elections, or do you not? And if you do not have free and fair elections and a peaceful turnover of leadership, you do not have a democracy. So that's one basic distinction between regime types. And then a government or administration, as we commonly refer to it in the US, is basically who rules. So we can talk about the Biden, the Trump, the Obama, the Bush administrations. You could talk about the Boris Johnson government in the UK, the Theresa May government in the UK, etc. So here's just some more examples to illustrate what these terms mean. So a state, what is ruled? So when you look at a world map and you see the borders that are listed here, that are demarcated between countries, right? Each of these countries is a state. So you can basically think that country is synonymous with state. A regime, as I mentioned before, is how that state is ruled, and we're going to look at the regimes of the world data, but you can see here how this particular data collection project defines different types of regimes based on the elections that either are present or are not present. Are they free? Are they not fair for the executive or the legislature, right? So countries that are, I know this is not colorblind friendly, but countries that are in this red are closed autocracies, so they don't have any elections through multi-parties or any multi-party elections for the executive or the legislature. Those that do, but they aren't free and fair, are electoral autocracies, and this is actually the most common type of autocracy today, is an electoral autocracy. Then you have electoral democracies, which do have free and fair elections and a peaceful turnover of leadership. So they do have multi-party elections, but they don't go one step further and protect civil and political rights, whereas liberal democracies do. And this is liberal, not in like the U.S. Democratic Party progressive sense of the word, but this is liberal in like the John Locke, protecting individuals from the tyranny of the government. And a government is who rules. So these are all of the female heads of state, so prime ministers or presidents back in, I want to say 2020, it looks like, right? So these are all of the women who were the main executive of their countries. And if you're wondering like, wait, why did I not include the rest of them? This was it for 2020. And this is from 2021, I believe, or 2023 countries that have female heads of state. So basically like the chief executive of their country. Now, a nation is a little bit different. So you probably have heard about nation states. A nation is defined this way, right? So nations are groups of people who feel like they have a shared identity. And so sometimes you have nations corresponding with the borders of a state and you have nation states, but sometimes you have nations, so groups of people who feel like they have similar characteristics and want to govern themselves, but do not have their own state in which they can do that. So Kurds are a nation. They're an ethnic group who would like to have their own country, but they do not have their own country. There are Kurds that are located in various other countries, but there's no Kurdish state per se. There is an autonomous region of Iraq called Kurdistan, but that is also still within the borders of Iraq. That's not its own separate state. So, characteristics of the modern state. Now that we've clarified what a state versus a regime versus a government versus a nation is. So, modern states have four main characteristics. The reading for this week had talked kind of about three, but we can really think about legitimacy, sovereignty of two types, territory, and then also bureaucracy, because you need to have a bureaucracy in order to be able to implement the political goods that states provide. So, four characteristics of the modern state, right? As I just mentioned, modern states have territory, they have sovereignty, external and internal, and I'll tell you in just a moment what that means. They have different types of legitimacy, and they have a bureaucracy, and that bureaucracy helps them implements the laws and the policies that the state creates. And this is an ideal type, right? Like, states do score on different dimensions, right? They may score really high on one but lower on the others. So this is an ideal type. So obviously states have territory, right? We could look at the borders of the United States and say that obviously the United States has some specific territory, but territories can change, right? If we looked at a map of Europe back in the 50s during the Cold War, it would look a lot different than a map of Europe today. So territories obviously can change, new states can be created from old ones, and also territories can be contested. So India and Pakistan, both two states, so two countries, they have a territory that's currently administered by India called Kashmir, as well as a part that's administered by Pakistan, and there is this line of control here. Both countries claim that all of this should be theirs, and so states can have territorial disputes, often with their neighbors. But generally, the borders of states are uncontested. So states also have sovereignty, and there's two types. So sovereignty of the domestic version refers to being recognized as the sole authority within your territory that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. So that means that you, as the government of said state, are the one who runs the military, and the state has a police force, and so you do not have rebel organizations roaming the country, claiming parts of the territory, right? It's the only use of force that's authorized is what's done by the government who represents that state. So that's internal sovereignty. And that also refers to being able to make and implement laws and policies, because you do have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And then external sovereignty refers to being able to defend yourself from external threat, right? Being not too reliant on external powers, and very importantly, being recognized as a state by other member states. So there definitely are countries like that seem to be states that would meet the characteristics of being a modern state, but that are not recognized in the United Nations. And so generally, this is a map of countries that are members of the United Nations, and you could see in the different colors here the years that they joined. If you are a member of the United Nations, you have external sovereignty because you have been recognized as a member state by your other fellow states. There are entities that conceivably are like states, like Taiwan, for example, that meet the characteristics of a modern state but do not have external sovereignty because there are other member states of the United Nations, China in particular, who will not allow Taiwan into the United Nations because China does not believe that Taiwan is its own state. China believes that it's actually part of China. And then obviously countries can have their internal sovereignty challenged, which is what we see in the context of any kind of a civil war or uprising where rebels end up controlling territory, as was the case in Somalia as well as in Syria for sure. States also have legitimacy, which refers to basically the claims that rulers make about their right to be in charge, and then also it's whether people accept their claims for why they're in charge or not. So it's not enough that you have territory, right? It's not enough that you have internal and external sovereignty, but you have to, in order to not always be repressing everybody and repressing some opposition, you have to have some legitimacy. So the people who you're governing over have to accept your authority, right? And so this can come from traditional legitimacy, such as through like monarchies and like dynastic monarchies. This can be a charismatic version of legitimacy that comes from being a popular leader, for example. Like oftentimes, leaders who take their countries from being a colonial power to being independent, as was the case throughout countries in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as a lot of countries actually in sub-Saharan Africa too, those leaders end up being really charismatic, and so they have a sense of legitimacy based on the fact that they're popular. And then the final kind of legitimacy is rational legal. This is what we would expect in democracies, where you have a rule of law, where there's some set of laws that are implemented and enforced and are equal for everybody, right? And so you have rational legal legitimacy because you, for example, won a free and fair election. And these are just examples of different types of legitimacy that people might have. So Mahatma Gandhi obviously had a lot of charismatic legitimacy. Tribal leaders in Afghanistan may have traditional legitimacy, as does the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And then Boris Johnson, not popular to everybody. Not everybody in the UK loved him, but he was a relatively popular prime minister. And he also came to office through free and fair elections, and so he had that rational legal legitimacy as well. And then the final thing that states have is they have some kind of bureaucracy, where you have officials like a civil service, right, who implements the laws of the states as directed by the executive. And so these would be doing things like collecting taxes and building and maintaining schools and paving roads and, providing pensions and in some countries, a government-run health insurance, for example, right? So when the bureaucracy is effective, when people feel like their interactions with the state are effective, so if you go to the DMV and you have a fabulous experience renewing your license and everybody is friendly and it's super efficient, right, that also will increase the state's legitimacy and therefore increase its internal sovereignty as well. And if you're interested, you could click on this link for the World Bank Bureaucracy Indicators Dashboard. All right, so we've talked about some defining characteristics. We've talked about what makes up a state. That's 4 characteristics. Now we're going to talk about state strength, because the discussion activity that you're doing for this week, you'll have to use a data set called the Fragile State Index that is a way of measuring state strength. You'll see how they measure state strength, but I'm going to share with you how we generally define state strength in comparative politics. So states use their territory, their sovereignty, their legitimacy, and their bureaucracy to provide political goods to the people who live within their borders. So political goods are things like security, the rule of law, a functioning legal system, infrastructure, economic policies, etc., right? So this way that we're thinking about state strength, I just want to contrast that with the way that we think about strength in international relations, which I'll get to in just a moment. But these are like the political goods. These are the things that you would expect the state, the government, to provide for you. So strong states are generally capable of providing these, right? Weak states only partially provide them, and failed states or fragile states are so weak that they actually cannot provide any of them because they lose control over sovereignty in their territory. So this is a different way of thinking about state strength than we would be discussing it if we were in an international relations course. For example, if we think about state strength in the international relations context, where we're really focused on the relationships between countries in the international system, we would definitely be looking almost exclusively, not entirely, but we'd be looking a lot at military spending, right? So the US is a very strong state when it comes to military spending. It's outspends a lot of other countries around the world. And so from the perspective of international relations, another subfield of political science where the focus is on how countries interact with each other internationally, you can see why state strength is measured differently there, right? And then we could also look at, for example, US spending relative to the G7. So these are the other kind of group of 7 countries that have the biggest economies, as is described here, right? The US definitely outspends others as a percentage of GDP. A different way, though, of looking at state strength from the comparative politics perspective looks at more than just military power, right? Yes, that's part of external sovereignty, but a modern state is more than just having external sovereignty. It has internal sovereignty, it has legitimacy, it has a bureaucracy, it has a territory, right? And so we are going to look at the Fragile States Index in this week's discussion, and you could see the U.S. is not the strongest state in the world, actually, according to the Fragile States Index, right? It's in this green, again, not super color-friendly colors, unfortunately, but it's in this green, which means that, yes, it's in like the stable category, but it's certainly not in the sustainable category. This is actually a data collection project that ranks countries according to weakest and strongest, right? So you do not want to be number one on this list, and we can go to this link right here, right now, just as to show you. Right, so this is the Fragile State Index heat map, and then if we were to go to, for example, their global data, we can see that the weakest state in the world, the most fragile, is Somalia, and we'd have to scroll down a fair ways here to get to the United States. I think I've scrolled too far. So the U.S. is 141st. So military power, yes, U.S. is absolutely number one, but the strongest state when we're looking at things from a comparative politics perspective is Norway, according to the Fragile States Index. All right, so now we're going to transition into our last section, and we'll talk about political regimes. So there's lots of ways to think about how to measure political regimes, and there's a ton of variation in autocracies, there's a ton of variation in democracies, but here is one basic way, which looks at, do you have free and fair elections, right, for selecting the executive of your country, or for a parliament that selects the executive of their country? Because we select the executive directly in a presidential democracy like we have in the US, but voters vote for political parties in a parliamentary system, and the prime minister is chosen from the party that wins a majority in the election. So either way, it's people who are voting for who runs the country, right? So one basic way we can think about is, do you have elections at all, right? If you don't have elections, you're a closed autocracy. So China, Saudi Arabia fall into this category, all right? Going down this flow chart. If you have elections, but they're not contested, which basically means that, are you not allowing more than one political party to run for office? So effectively, there are elections, but there's just one party that runs. If that's you, then you're a hegemonic autocracy. So Tunisia, yes, used to fall into that category, but it was, after the Arab Spring, considered an electoral democracy. So I would put Tunisia in this category in like the 2000s, for example, as opposed to post Arab Spring. Then let's say you have contested elections where you have multiple parties who can run for office, but they're not free and fair, right? If you have elections with multiple parties running for office, but they're not free or fair, which means free refers to anybody who meets the criteria can vote. Fair means that any political party who wants to register and who meets like whatever criteria you have is allowed to run. Then if you do not have that, then you are a competitive autocracy. And if you have free and fair elections, but you do not go and protect additional checks and balances or political rights, then you are an electoral democracy. And if you do, you are a liberal democracy. So this is one way of differentiating between different types of regimes by focusing solely on, do you have elections? Is there just one party who can run for office, or can you have multiple parties run for office? And if you have multiple parties, are your elections free or fair? And then, do you protect political and civil rights? So that's just one way of thinking about things. Another way of thinking about political regimes uses a similar type of structure where we're comparing the elections that are being held, but really only looks at 4 categories, right? This previous distinction had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different types of regime. This one effectively collapses these 2 into 1, right? So here, closed autocracies do not have multi-party elections that are unfree and unfair. Electoral autocracies do have multi-party elections, but again, they're not free or fair. And then you have your electoral democracies and liberal democracies. So this is just one way of classifying political regimes. That's based on what degree of free and fair elections do you have in election, or what degree of like freedom and fairness do you have in elections, rather. But that's not the only way of classifying autocracies. And yes, electoral versus closed autocracies is an important distinction, but it doesn't get at who is actually in charge. So we're going to we'll get to that in just a moment. So basically, all non-democratic regimes have these characteristics, right? You have freedom that's restricted because you don't have any checks and balances or provision or protections for human rights. You have a small group of people who are really running the country. The government's not constitutionally responsible, so people are not getting elected. They don't have rational legal legitimacy in the sense that we would expect with free and fair elections. And usually when we think about autocracies, like specific people come to mind. So we might think of leaders like Mussolini and Stalin and Hitler, etc. And yes, there definitely are autocracies or authoritarian regimes or dictatorships. We can use these terms interchangeably. There are definitely regimes that were totalitarian, like the ones that I just described, where the state, like the government, controlled all aspects of society. There was no freedom at all. But not all autocracies are totalitarian. So I put a screenshot here of the George Orwell novel 1984. That is definitely a totalitarian regime, but not all of the leaders who are in what's actually a children's book from Spain, not all of these leaders were totalitarian. Some of them were just autocratic in the sense that they didn't allow the political opposition, some of it, to run for office, and they effectively end up running the country. There was no rational legal legitimacy to their rule. And then if you would like to see this children's book from Spain of different dictators, I have provided it on a slide for you here. Spain did have its own dictator, Francisco Franco, who was the longest standing dictator who ruled a country in Western Europe, almost 40 years. He ended up dying, and then Spain democratized. So hence probably this being a Spanish book. So there's, like I said, there's different ways to focus on or to define autocracies. And so yes, we can look at, are there elections, but we can also look at who was in charge, right? So Milan Sfolik is a political scientist. Last I checked, he was at Yale. He wrote a book in the early 2010s that looked at autocratic rule. And he said, okay, we can look at all these different autocracies and think about, to what extent is the military involved? To what extent can you have parties who run for office? To what extent is there a legislature? And is there a single or is there multi-party competition? And to what extent do you even have elections for the executive, and are they multi-party ones? And then you can look at the distribution of autocracies, focusing on, do they have multiple parties? Do they have only one party, or are parties banned altogether? And you can see that actually over time, the proportion of regimes that have multiple parties has increased substantially, whereas those that have single parties have gone down. So by far the most common type of autocracy today is one that allows multiple parties to run. But they're not still free and fair, just to be clear, right? And then you could see here too the legislative selection and dictatorships and how that's varied over time. I also wanted to share with you just some different data sets We are not going to look at these specific data sets, but we're going to look at an extension of one of these data sets, the Chaibub et al. Data set from 2020 that was extended through 2025 by other researchers. And they just differentiate between basically three types of dictatorships: those that are run by the military, those that are run by royals, and those that are essentially run by a civilian party, whether that's it's usually obviously one party who's running it, and then it can vary whether they allow other parties to run for office or not. But other data sets define autocracies in other ways too, right? Focusing on, do you have a multi-party, single party, or no party civilian autocracy? Some data sets also include this category of a personalist regime, which would really just be when you have one leader who's in charge and like all other kind of like elites are subsumed to that leader. That's not always the case. Sometimes you have an actual like military junta, like a military organization who runs a country in a dictatorship. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention is that dictatorships, we can think about them in different ways, right? So we can think about, do they have elections, and to what extent do they allow multiple parties to run even if they're not free and fair? We can think about how they vary in terms of who's in charge, but all dictatorships use these three strategies of rule, which is going to be different than what we see in democracies, because in democracies, you don't really have to repress people because you have come to power through free and fair elections, so you have a popular mandate to some extent, which increases your legitimacy. People know that if they don't like your policies, you can be voted out of office. That keeps leaders accountable, right? You don't have that in dictatorships, so you do end up getting opposition, and dictators do end up repressing. So one of the things we know from a lot of comparative politics literature is that democracies tend to repress far, far less than autocracies do. Repression tends to happen in dictatorships, which makes sense that it would, because there's no checks on on leaders' power. If you're interested, you can go to these different data sets and look at human rights data sets. So repression would be all of these things, right? Sometimes it ranges from the relatively, less invasive on people's bodies and just like restricting their ability to vote, all the way up to like extremely invasive political violence directed at citizens by the state. That's called state repression. So things like extrajudicial killings, disappearances of people, right? The secret police come to your house in the middle of the night, they whisk you away, your family never hears from you again. That happens far too often in dictatorships. People are tortured, people are imprisoned for their political stances, right? So these are all of the things that dictatorships do to stay in charge, in combination with co-opting the opposition. So basically trying to provide people material incentives, and then they also they try to be legitimate through things like the dynastic family, like in the case of a lot of the absolute monarchies in the Middle East, who have either direct claims to being descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, or like in the case of, for example, the king of Morocco and Jordan, or in the case of Saudi Arabia, they get their legitimacy from being the guardians of two of the holiest sites of Islam in Saudi Arabia. Dictatorships could try to get their legitimacy from religion, from having popular support through, for example, fraudulent elections where they win with like 99% of the vote. Like, they're not fooling anybody, but still they do that based on their ideology, etc. So you can really think of like repression as like the sticks that leaders use to stay in charge, co-optation are the carrots, and legitimation are the ideas that leaders use to stay in charge. And then if you're interested in Iran in particular, Iran is an interesting case that combines religious ideology as a justification for why the regime is in charge with actually elections. You can look at this Iran primer. And that's it for this lecture about states and regimes.